Along the lower Missouri River in the autumn of 1874, a flat-bottomed cargo barge called the Lena Marsh sat lodged against a willow-choked bank 3 miles south of the town of Holt's Ferry, Missouri. She had not moved in 11 years. The river had dropped around her, leaving her hull canted 4 degrees to the starboard side, her oak planking gray and warped, her iron cleats rusted to the color of old blood. Cattails had grown up through the gaps in her foredeck. A family of muskrats had made their home beneath her sternmost bilge. The men at the ferry landing called her a hazard and a disgrace, and more than one of them had suggested, over the course of those 11 years, that the county ought to burn her where she sat. No one had gone aboard in all that time. The woman who now stood on the crumbling mudbank and looked up at her was 26 years old, and she had not eaten since the morning of the day before. Her name was Clara Dodd. She had arrived in Holt's Ferry 4 days earlier on the back of a freight wagon, sitting atop a canvas-wrapped bundle of her father's caulking tools, which were the only thing she owned outright. The wagon driver had not asked her destination. She had not offered it. She had simply climbed down at the crossroads nearest the river and walked toward the sound of moving water, which was the only geography she had ever fully trusted. Her father, James Dodd, had worked the river barges for 31 years as a caulker and heel inspector, traveling the Missouri and its tributaries between St. Joseph and the confluence at the south, and he had been the finest at his trade along a 300-mile stretch of water. He had taught Clara the work from the time she was 9 years old, first handing her the iron caulking iron to feel its weight, then showing her how to read the seams of a hull by pressing her palm flat against the wood and feeling for the gave that meant rot had set in beneath. He had not been a man who explained things in the general. He had explained them through the specific, through the particular plank and the particular seam, and the particular morning light coming off the water that showed you the difference between weathered wood and compromised wood. Clara had understood more from watching his hands than from anything he had said, though what he said stayed with her too, the way a well-driven oakum plug stays in a seam long after the mallet has moved on. James Dodd had died of a fever in the spring of 1874, leaving Clara a set of tools, a bag of oakum, a small tin of pine pitch, and $17. The $17 had lasted 3 weeks. There was no work for a woman hull inspector in any town she had tried, and she had tried 4 of them. In the first, a place called Whitmore's Landing, a dock manager had listened to her with his arms folded and his eyes fixed on a point over her shoulder, and when she finished speaking, he had told her she had mistaken his establishment for one that hired women in skilled trade capacities. In the second town, the ferryman had not listened at all, only shaken his head before she had finished her first sentence. In the third and fourth, she had received some variation of patience and mild pity, the kind extended to a person whose situation is understood to be hopeless before she herself has accepted it. The ferrymen and dock managers she spoke to listened to her explanation with something between patience and amusement, and then they told her they had no use for her, and she thanked them and walked out and found somewhere cheap to sleep. And in the morning she walked to the next town and tried again. By the time she reached Holt's Ferry, she had $2.40 remaining, and the cold nights were shortening what a dollar could buy. She had heard about the Lena Marsh on the evening of her second day in town, sitting at the far end of a plank table in the boarding house where she had taken the cheapest room, listening to 2 rivermen argue about whether the county would eventually force the removal of the wreck. One of them, a grizzled ferryman named Roy Briggs, had said the thing was worthless, rotted through stem to stern, and that whoever had owned her had done the smartest thing possible by abandoning her and walking away. The other man had laughed and said he wouldn't touch her for any sum. Clara had listened without appearing to listen, and the next morning she had walked the 3 miles downriver along the bank. Now she stood and looked at the barge and felt the weight of her father's largest caulking iron through the canvas bundle at her back. The Lena Marsh was roughly 60 feet long and 15 feet wide, the standard flat-hulled configuration used for bulk cargo transport on the Missouri shallows. Her sides were perhaps 4.5 feet high amidships. There was no wheelhouse, only a low deck house aft with a warped door that hung open at an angle, its leather hinge entirely rotted through. The hull below the waterline was buried in mud and silt, but the portion of the hull she could see above the bank line showed her what she needed to know, or the beginning of it. The planking on the near side was gray and weathered, yes, and there were gaps along 2 of the upper seams. She could see no daylight coming through the lower seams from this angle. That was something. She did not decide anything yet. She climbed down the bank, bracing her boots against the exposed willow roots, and she walked around the bow of the barge to look at the riverside of the hull. The morning light came off the water and lit the planking at an angle, raking across the grain and throwing every irregularity into relief. She put her right hand flat against the oak and pressed. She worked from bow to stern along the river-facing side, pressing at intervals, listening to the sound of the wood, moving her palm to find the soft spots. She found 3 of them, each about the span of her hand, in the lower run of the hull. 3 soft spots over 60 feet of riverside planking. Her father's voice came to her, even and instructive. 3 soft spots do not a dead hull make, Clara. You find soft spots in the best timber in the world. What you are looking for is the hard wood in between. The hard wood in between was substantial. She knocked along the hull with her knuckle and listened to the report. The sound that came back was neither the dull thud of a compromised plank nor the hollow pop of delaminating wood. It was a solid, clean knock, the sound of oak that had density and integrity, and she moved from plank to plank with the methodical patience her father had taught her, establishing the condition of the hull by its own testimony. Below the waterline, the hull was packed in river silt, which was not nothing. Silt packing along a grounded hull was a natural caulking, and it told her the lower run of planking had likely been protected for the years of grounding, sealed against the river and against the oxygen that rot requires to do its work. The upper seams were the trouble, open to air and weather, and those she could read by sight. 2 of them had opened to roughly the width of a finger. The rest were tight. She stood back and looked at the whole of the barge in the yellow morning light, and she made her calculation. The 3 soft spots in the lower run were a known quantity, treatable. The 2 open upper seams would need driving and repacking before winter rains arrived. The hull was canted but not sprung. The deckhouse was a ruin of rotted leather and warped planking, but deckhouses were not structural. She had seen men pay good money for hulls in worse condition than this one, provided the man had the skill to judge them properly. She also had 30 cents remaining in her coat pocket, $2.40 that she had not spent, and she knew what $8 would buy her at the county land office if the county held title to this wreck, which she suspected it did. If you have come this far, and you wonder what possessed a woman with $2.40 to stand in the river mud and look at a wreck the county wanted to burn, leave a thought below. There are still people today who can name what she saw in the Lena Marsh that October morning, and it was not romance, and it was not optimism. It was her father's education, applied to 60 feet of Missouri oak. The county land office was in the courthouse at Holt's Ferry, a 2-story brick building on the main street with a clock above the door that had stopped at 3:15 and had not been corrected in living memory. Clara arrived there at 9 in the morning and asked the clerk at the window about the Lena Marsh. The clerk, A man named Perkins told her without looking up from his papers that the barge had been listed as abandoned property since 1863, that it had been assessed twice by the county and judged without value on both occasions, and that it was currently held by the county pending disposition. Clara asked what disposition meant in practical terms. Perkins looked up then. He told her it meant they were going to burn it as soon as the fire risk from dry summer grass had passed, which was not yet, since the grass was still dry. He said they expected to do it in November. Clara asked what they would take for it. Perkins set down his pen. He studied her for a long moment. He told her they had never been asked that question. He said he would have to consult with the county assessor. He asked her to come back in the afternoon. She came back in the afternoon. Perkins told her the county assessor had set a price of $8, which was what they calculated the iron hardware on the deck would fetch as scrap, since that was the only material on the vessel with any recoverable value. Perkins said this with a tone that suggested he expected her to respond as any reasonable person would, which was to say she would decline and leave. Clara counted out $8 from the fold of bills inside her coat. She had 30 cents remaining. Perkins looked at the money on the counter for a moment that stretched longer than was comfortable. He took it. He wrote out a bill of sale on county letterhead and stamped it and handed it to her. The Lena Marsh, one flat-hulled cargo barge, 60 feet in length, hull number LM1841, was now hers. She walked out of the courthouse holding the bill of sale, and she stood on the street for a moment in the October sunlight. She had 30 cents, a set of caulking tools, and a derelict barge 3 miles downriver. She also had until November. Roy Briggs was sitting on a crate outside the ferry office when she walked past, and he watched her go with an expression that had something of pity in it and something of confusion, and he called out that she had bought herself a fine lot of muskrats. Clara thanked him and kept walking. The first thing she did was sleep aboard the deck house that night, which was warmer than it had any right to be, the low space having retained the heat of the afternoon sun through its planked roof. She had her father's canvas bundle for a bed and her coat for a blanket, and she lay there in the dark and listened to the river moving past the hull and felt the barge breathe in it, the slight flecks of the planking against the silt, alive in the way that boats remain alive even when they appear to be finished. The sound of moving water against a wooden hull was a particular thing, not violent, not intrusive, more like the low murmur of a voice in the next room that you have stopped needing to understand and simply allow to be present. Her father had called it the river keeping you company, and she had accepted this as a child the way children accept their father's descriptions of the world, and now she accepted it as an adult because it was accurate. She had felt that quality of attention in her father's hands as a child, the way he would put his palm on a hull and go still as if listening to a heartbeat. She understood it now in a way that had not been possible when she was 9. She began work before dawn. The most urgent task was the upper seams. If she did not address the open seams before the autumn rains came in earnest, water would sheet down the interior of the hull and begin working on the hull from inside, which was a different and worse problem than weathering from outside. She opened her father's kit and took out the caulking iron, a flat-bladed driving iron with a handle worn smooth from 31 years of his grip, and the caulking mallet, and the oakum, which was twisted hemp fiber impregnated with pine tar. Her father had bought his oakum from a supplier in St. Joseph, and he had always specified the long fiber grade because it packed tighter and lasted longer than the short fiber variety most men bought because it was cheaper. He had been right about this, as he had been right about most things that had to do with water and wood and time. She drove oakum into the upper seams with steady, methodical strokes, working from bow to stern along the port side, and then back along the starboard. The mallet report was clean in the river morning. A heron on the opposite bank watched her work for a time, and then lost interest and went back to standing in the shallows. The cattails on the foredeck moved in a small wind off the water. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, stopping once to drink from the river and to eat the last of the cornbread she had brought from the boarding house. By late afternoon, she had sealed the port side upper seams and half of the starboard. She did not know yet what was in the hold. The hatch covers on the Lena Marsh were iron-framed and planked in oak, and they were secured by a double-lock hasp system that she had never seen on a cargo barge. Most barge hatches used a simple drop bar or a single padlock. The Lena Marsh had 2 hasps of substantial iron, each fitted with a mechanism that required a specific key, and both locks were in place and locked. She noticed this on her second morning when she finished the caulking of the upper seams and turned her attention to inspecting the deck. The locks were rusted but intact. Someone had locked this hatch, and someone had taken the key with them when they left, or had never returned to use it. She did not break the locks. Her father had told her once that a locked thing deserved to be unlocked, not broken, because breaking told you nothing, and unlocking told you everything. She set the locks aside in her mind and continued her assessment. What she could see of the hold came through a narrow gap at the forward corner of the aft hatch cover, where the planking had shrunk slightly away from the iron frame in the dry summer heat. She pressed her face to the gap and let her eyes adjust to the darkness below. The hold was not flooded. That was the first thing she noted. The silt packing along the riverside and the sealed seams had done their work. What she could see of the hold floor showed no standing water. The second thing she noted was that the hold was not empty. She could see in the bar of light that came through the gap what appeared to be a series of shapes, stacked forms, rectangular. She could not yet determine what they were, but they were not cargo detritus, not the loose scraps of rope and broken spar that filled most abandoned hold spaces. Whatever was stacked in the Lena Marsh had been placed there with intention. She needed to open the hatch, and she needed a way to do it without destroying the locks. It was the lock itself that told her what she needed. The hasp mechanism was of a type her father had shown her once on a trip they had made together to assess a sunken lighter near Jefferson City. He had called it a river-bonded lock, used specifically for barge cargo that was insured against theft, because the insurance company required proof that the hatch had not been tampered with upon delivery. The mechanism used a double-bitted key, which meant the lock had 2 separate tumblers. Her father had shown her how to read such a lock by feel, using a thin iron probe to find the tumbler positions. It was not a skill she had practiced often, but she had practiced it, and she had the probes in her father's kit, slender steel rods no thicker than a knitting needle, each bent at a different angle at the tip. She worked the first lock for most of the third morning. She knelt on the deck with the lock in her hands and the probe in the keyhole, and she moved through the tumblers by feel, finding each one and holding it while she addressed the next, the way her father had described it, which was less like picking a lock than like listening to one. The iron mechanism was stiff with rust, and the tumblers moved in small, reluctant increments. Her knees ached from the deck planking. A cold wind came off the river, and she tucked her chin into the collar of her coat and kept working. The first lock gave it shortly after midday. She allowed herself a single breath of relief and set the opened lock aside and took up the probe for the second. The second lock was in better condition, perhaps because the starboard exposure had kept it drier, and it moved with less resistance. She had the second lock open within the hour. She did not rush. She sat for a moment on the deck and looked at the opened hasps and the hatch cover and the river beyond the bow. And she thought about what her father had told her once, near the end of a long day on the water, about the things that held still and waited. He had been talking about the river itself, about how it never stopped moving and yet was always there in the same bed, always the same river, patient in a way that human patience could not quite match. She had been 14 that day, sitting in the bow of his flatboat with her feet hanging over the gunwale, and the light had been the same angle as it was now, late afternoon gold coming from the west, and the water had been carrying the same brown color it always carried in October. She had not entirely understood him at the time. She was beginning to understand him now. The river had not gone anywhere. The barge had not gone anywhere. The locks had held. Whatever was below the hatch, covers had been held still and waiting for the right morning and the right hand, and she had supplied both without knowing in advance that she would need to. She lifted the hatch cover. The cold came up from below first, the sealed air of 11 years pressing out past her into the October afternoon, and with it came the smell of pine pitch and hemp and something else, something dry and papery that she could not immediately name. She held the hatch cover open and leaned over the opening and let the light reach down into the hold. The hold of the Lena Marsh was packed with bales. They were wrapped in oilskin and bound with waxed cord, stacked in the main hold from floor to deckhead in 3 rows and running the full 60 feet of the barge's cargo length. They were tightly and uniformly packed, each bale approximately 2 feet long and 18 inches wide and a foot deep, and there were a great many of them. She counted along the nearest row from her vantage at the open hatch, 14 bales in that row alone, and there were 3 rows deep, and the forward hold was also packed. She descended the iron ladder into the hold and lifted the nearest bale. It was heavy, far heavier than she had expected from its size, and dense. The weight of it told her something. Light freight in oilskin wrapping would be bulk goods, grain, dried goods, compressed fibers. What she held was denser than grain, with the specific compact heaviness of bound paper. She set it on the ladder platform and took out her clasp knife and cut the waxed cord and folded back the oilskin with careful hands. Inside the oilskin was a second wrapping of treated canvas, and inside the treated canvas were books. Not one book, but a stack of them, 8 volumes pressed together, their leather covers intact and dry and supple in her hands, in a way that had no business being possible after 11 years in a sealed hold. The oilskin and canvas wrapping had done their work with the precision of craft that knew exactly what it was protecting, double-wrapped against moisture. The inner canvas layer treated with a linseed-based waterproofing that had held its integrity across 11 years of temperature change and river air. Someone had known what they were putting in here and had not wanted it damaged. She opened the topmost volume and turned to the title page and read it by the light coming down from the open hatch. It was a commercial ledger. The heading named the Missouri River Freight Bonding Company, and below it, in a clear clerical hand, were the words Accounts Receivable, 1859 through 1862. She set that one aside and opened the second volume in the bale. Another ledger. Same heading, different years. 1856 through 1858. She put the ledgers down on the hold floor and stood in the cold, still air of the Lena Marsh and felt the weight of what she was holding in her mind, not yet in her hands, because her hands were busy pressing against the nearest row of bales and counting. 14 bales across, 3 rows deep. At 8 volumes per bale, that was 336 volumes in this hold section alone, and the forward hold was also packed. She moved forward, stepping carefully over the bales, and confirmed the forward hold. 16 bales in the forward section, each wrapped and stacked with the same precision. She sat on the lowest rung of the ladder for a long time. The Missouri River Freight Bonding Company had ceased to exist in 1863. She knew the name because her father had worked for bonded freight houses along the Missouri for much of his career, and he had spoken of the Freight Bonding Company the way a man speaks of an institution that had once had great power and had lost it abruptly under circumstances that remained, even years later, a subject of some bitterness among the men who had worked the river. The company had been the largest independent cargo bonding house on the Missouri, ensuring the freight of hundreds of independent haulers against loss and theft and damage. In 1863, it had collapsed. The men her father knew had lost their bonds without compensation. The official explanation had been that the company's assets were insufficient to cover its liabilities. Claims had gone unpaid. Haulers who had paid premiums for years received nothing when their cargo was lost. What was stacked in the hold of the Lena Marsh was the complete financial record of the Missouri River Freight Bonding Company, from its founding through its final year of operation. She understood, in the cold air of the hold, that this was not accidental. The records had been sealed, wrapped against moisture with skilled and expensive care, transported aboard a bonded barge, and locked under a double hasp. Someone had put these records on this barge on purpose. Someone had locked the hatch and not come back. She needed to know who, and she needed to know why the records had been removed from the company's offices before the collapse. Both questions had answers somewhere in 336 volumes of ledger books. She began that afternoon. She carried bales up from the hold one at a time, working steadily, setting them out in the deckhouse where the light through the warped planking of the walls gave her enough to read by. She opened them in order, oldest first, and she read with the systematic attention her father had taught her to bring to a hull inspection, which amounted to one principle above all others. You read everything, because the thing that matters is never the thing that looks most important. It is the small anomaly in an otherwise ordinary run of data. The small anomaly appeared in the ledgers for 1861. In the accounts receivable for that year, in the column tracking premium payments from independent haulers, there was a pattern that would have been invisible to someone reading quickly and obvious to someone reading slowly. A series of haulers, 17 of them, had been marked in the margin with a small penciled notation that appeared to be an invoice reference number. The invoice reference numbers were in a sequence that did not match the company's own numbering system, which she could establish because the company's numbering system was consistent throughout the ledgers she had already read. These 17 haulers had been notated with a separate, private numbering system, and they had all made their premium payments in full through the autumn of 1862. She cross-referenced the names of the 17 haulers against the claims records for 1863, which she found in the last bale of the forward hold. 14 of the 17 had filed claims in 1863 when the company collapsed. All 14 claims had been denied. She set the ledger down on the deckhouse floor and sat with her back against the warm planked wall in the fading afternoon light and thought about 14 haulers who had paid their premiums faithfully for years, filed their claims in good faith when their cargo was lost, and received nothing, about what the private numbering system in the margin meant, about who had put these records on this barge and locked the hatch. It was Roy Briggs who gave her the final piece. She found him the next morning at the ferry landing, sitting in the same posture he always occupied, watching the river with the patient attention of a man who had been paid to watch rivers for most of his life and had not entirely retired from the habit. She sat down nearby on a coil of rope and asked him what he knew about the Missouri River Freight Bonding Company. He gave her a long sideways look, The kind a man gives when he suspects a question has a reason behind it. He has not yet been told. He said he knew more than he cared to. He had been a young man on the river in those years, hauling dry goods on a shallow draft flatboat between Holt's Ferry and the river towns to the south, and he had bonded his cargo with the freight bonding company for 3 years before the collapse. He had lost 2 consignments of flour and cornmeal to a spring flood in 1862, filed his claim, and received a letter the following year informing him that his claim had been assessed and denied on the grounds that his coverage had lapsed. He showed her the letter. He had kept it for 11 years in a tin box under his bunk, and it was still sharp at the folds and legible throughout, the handwriting of the claims adjuster clear and formal and carrying not a syllable of apology in it. His coverage had not lapsed. She could prove it from the ledger for 1861, in which his premium payments were recorded in full through September of 1862. His name was in the column of 17 haulers with the private notations in the margin. He sat very still when she told him this. He asked her how she knew. She told him about the barge, about the oilskin bales, about the ledgers. She told him about the private numbering system and the 14 denied claims and the pattern she had found across the accounts. Roy Briggs was 61 years old and had the weathered patience of a man who had long since stopped expecting the world to correct its errors. He listened to everything she said and was quiet for a long time after she finished. Then he asked her who had put the records on the barge. She said she did not know yet. She said she intended to find out. What she found in the final series of bales she had not yet opened took another 2 days to work through. The last section of the forward hold contained not ledger books but correspondence files, a series of letter books bound in brown waxed board, and in those letter books was a name that appeared in a context that made its significance plain. The name was Elias Comfort, who had been the general manager of the Missouri River Freight Bonding Company from 1857 through its dissolution in 1863. The correspondence files showed that Comfort had maintained a private arrangement with a freight forwarding firm in St. Louis, through which a portion of the premiums collected from a selected group of haulers, the 17 with the private marginal notations, had been quietly redirected. The premiums had been received, recorded, and then partially transferred through a set of shell accounts to the forwarding firm, which Comfort owned through a family member's name. The arrangement was described in Comfort's own handwriting in a letter to an associate whose name Clara did not recognize, a letter she suspected had been sent as a private memorandum and had been retained in the company's outgoing correspondence file by a clerk who did not understand what he was filing. When those 17 haulers filed their claims, the company's books showed the coverage as having lapsed because in the internal accounting system, Comfort controlled it had. The redirected premiums had not been recorded as valid coverage. The haulers had paid, and the coverage had been systematically voided in the books Comfort controlled. The records on this barge were the evidence that proved it. Someone had removed them and locked them away before Comfort could destroy them. She spent the evening in the deck house reading the final letter book, and near the back of it she found a single unsigned letter written in a different hand from the rest, a smaller and more careful hand than the clerical scripts throughout the rest of the correspondence, the hand of someone writing slowly and deliberately. The letter was addressed to no one and was written in the manner of a witness statement, setting out the arrangement in plain language, naming the shell accounts by number, naming the correspondence with the street, Louis Forwarding Firm, naming the dates on which the premium redirections had occurred and the method by which the internal records had been altered afterward. It was dated October 1863, the month the company had officially ceased operations. It had never been sent. It had been placed inside the letter book and sealed with the rest, and it read like a man who expected never to speak of this again. and wanted, despite that expectation, to put the thing on paper at least once. For the record, for the day when the record might matter to someone. The letter identified the writer as an accounts clerk named Thomas Webb, who had worked for the company from 1859 until its dissolution, and who had kept his own private copies of the redirected accounts as insurance against what he described as the certainty that, when the collapse came, Comfort would find a way to make the liability attached to someone else. Webb had arranged for the records to be transferred to the Barge in the weeks before the collapse, coordinating with the barge master, whose identity he gave as a man named Daniel Holt. He wrote that he did not know whether the records would ever be found or used, but that he had done what he could and intended to leave the territory before the legal proceedings began, as he believed his own employment records would implicate him if he remained. Daniel Holt. Clara read the name and set the letter book down. She looked at the dark river through the gap in the deckhouse wall and thought about a man who had locked a hatch and gone away and not come back, and about what that meant for a place named Holt's Ferry. She asked Roy Briggs the following morning about the history of the town's name. Briggs told her, with an expression of someone retrieving a thing they had not thought about in years, that the ferry had been established by a family named Holt in the 1840s, that the old ferryman had died before the war, and that his son had worked the river as a barge master for a time before disappearing. Nobody had talked about the Holt family in a long time. The legal proceedings in Holt's Ferry in December of 1874 were handled by a circuit judge who came to town specifically to receive the evidence she presented, the full contents of the hold of the Lena Marsh, 394 volumes of records including the letter books, the accounts ledgers, and the unsigned witness statement of Thomas Webb, which was accepted as documentary evidence despite the absence of a signature, because the internal consistency of its account was corroborated by the ledger records across multiple independent volumes. Elias Comfort had died in 1869, but his estate remained in the hands of his son in St. Louis, and the legal instruments available to the circuit judge allowed for the recovery of damages against an estate. Clara had consulted with the one lawyer in Holt's Ferry, a thin and meticulous man named Aldous March, who had read the records she brought him with the careful attention of someone who understood what he was looking at, and who had agreed to represent the interests of the 14 haulers or their surviving families on a contingency basis. It was not a fast process. The law was not fast. Roy Briggs knew this better than most. He came to the courthouse when the proceedings began, and he sat in the back row, and he did not speak or move for the full 3 hours of the first session. When it was over, he found Clara on the courthouse steps and stood beside her for a moment without saying anything. And then he said, in the level tone of a man who had learned not to want things too loudly, that he had not expected to be here for this. She said she was glad he was. That was as much as either of them said about it. The resolution of the estate claims took until the spring of 1875. 9 of the 14 haulers were dead. Their heirs, tracked through county records and 2 rounds of legal notices in the Rivertown newspapers, received the partial settlements that the estate could support, which were not full compensation for the losses of 1863, but were not nothing. Roy Briggs received a settlement in April, a bank draft for an amount that acknowledged the full value of his 2 lost consignments with interest calculated from the date of the denied claim. He held the draft for a long time before folding it. She was still living aboard the Lena Marsh. She had spent the winter repairing the barge with the focused attention of someone who had been given a task that was also a purpose, the 2 things rarely arriving together and not to be wasted when they did. With the money she received for the iron hardware on the deck, which she sold to a smithy in Holt's Ferry before the county could reclaim it, she bought the additional oakum and pine pitch she needed to address the remaining soft spots in the hull. She engaged 2 men from the ferry landing to help her free the hull from the silt bank in the early spring, when the river rose with snowmelt and gave the barge enough water beneath her to move. They had looked at her skeptically when she explained the plan, and she had shown them the hull inspection she had conducted and pointed to the specific planks she had reinforced and the seams she had repacked. And one of them, a man named Harlow, who had 20 years of river experience, had run his own hand along the hull and nodded in a way that acknowledged what he was touching, without conceding anything to the person who had done the work. The hull came free on a gray March morning, with a sound like a slow exhalation, the silt releasing its grip all along the port and starboard runs, and Clara stood on the deck as it leveled itself, the 4-degree list resolving as the water took the hull's weight. And she felt the barge become, again, what it had been built to be. She had no intention of hauling freight. She had a different use for 60 feet of sealed and watertight hold. She had written to a lawyer in St. Joseph about the regulations governing the establishment of a river record depot, a licensed holding facility for commercial documents requiring waterproof and secure storage, and the lawyer had written back that no specific license was required, only proof of hull integrity and a posted bond. She had the hull integrity. The bond was a matter of the spring and summer's work. The Lena Marsh moved upriver for the first time in 12 years on a warm morning in May of 1875. She moved under a hired tow arrangement with a wood-burning sidewheeler out of St. Joseph, and Clara Dodd stood at the bow with her father's caulking iron held in both hands at her chest, not for use, only for the weight of it, the worn wood of the handle against her palms, the 31 years of her father's grip pressed into the grain of it. And she watched the willow banks of the Missouri go past and felt the river under the hull that she had made whole. Roy Briggs watched the barge depart from the ferry landing. He stood on the bank and watched until the tow and the barge rounded the bend to the north and were gone behind the cottonwoods. He was a man of few surplus words, and he did not call anything after her. He picked up the rope coil he had set down to watch, and he went back to work. The record depot the Lena Marsh became served the river towns between Holt's Ferry and St. Joseph for 11 years, providing waterproof document storage to insurance firms, freight houses, and commercial banks. She expanded its operations twice, adding a second secured hold section in 1877 and a fireproof iron-lined inner vault in 1880. She trained 2 apprentices in hull inspection and caulking over those years, both of them young women who had come to the river looking for work and found instead a woman with a set of tools and an opinion about long fiber oakum. She kept the letter books and the accounts ledgers from the Lena Marsh's original cargo in the iron vault, cataloged and protected, not because they had ongoing legal relevance, which by 1876 they largely did not, but because Thomas Webb had put them on this barge when he had nothing else to do with the truth, and they deserved to stay dry. The caulking iron her father had owned for 31 years, and she had carried for one more hung on the vault wall above the iron-lined document cases. She had never found another use for it. It did not need one. It had already opened everything that mattered. If you have ever held something your father trusted you with and felt the full weight of what that means, tell that story below. There are more stories like this one on this channel, and they are all waiting for the right hand to open them.